There's nothing quite like the ache of losing family, and nothing quite like the miracle of finding them again. Some wounds cut so deep they never truly heal. They just learn to live quiet in your chest until something stirs them awake. In 1887, the town of Dry Creek had a problem they wanted gone. Eliza Thorn was what folks called simple, a mute woman who kept to herself and made people uncomfortable. So they loaded her into Murphy's wagon and sent her away to live with distant kin. 50 miles out on the Broken Arrow Ranch, Colt Ransom had built an empire in cattle and steel. But all his success couldn't fill the hole left by his baby sister, who vanished 30 years back. When that wagon pulled up to his porch and Eliza climbed down, dusty and scared, something in his heart recognized something in hers. Would this broken woman turn out to be the family he'd grieved all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hung low over the Broken Arrow Ranch, casting long shadows across the rolling Texas hills that stretched toward the horizon like a promise of forever. Colt Ransom stood on his wraparound porch, watching the dust settle from Murphy's wagon as it disappeared back down the rutted road toward Dry Creek. At 52, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who'd built something substantial from nothing, though the weight of old sorrows still showed in the set of his shoulders. Behind him, through the screen door, came the soft shuffle of uncertain footsteps. Eliza Thorn had barely moved since climbing down from that wagon an hour ago, standing in his front parlor like a deer caught between flight and freeze. She clutched a worn carpetbag against her chest, her dark hair pulled back severe and proper, though wisps had escaped during the long ride. Her dress was clean but faded, mended in places with careful stitches that spoke of pride despite poverty. "Ma'am," Colt said gently, turning from the porch rail. "I expect you're thirsty after that dusty road. Let me show you where you'll be staying." She looked up at him with eyes that held depths he couldn't quite fathom. Not simple or vacant, as the letter from Dry Creek had suggested, but watchful, wary. There was intelligence there, sharp and hidden, like light beneath dark water. When she nodded, it was barely a movement, but he caught it. The Broken Arrow sprawled across 15,000 acres of some of the finest grazing land in Texas. Colt had built the main house himself during his first prosperous years, adding rooms as his cattle business grew and his investments in the expanding railroad network paid dividends. The structure rose 2 stories, with wide porches and tall windows designed to catch every cooling breeze. Corrals and outbuildings spread in orderly fashion beyond the house. Barns, bunkhouses, a smithy, and storage sheds that housed the tools and equipment of a working ranch. "I built this place thinking family would fill it someday," Colt said as he led Eliza through rooms furnished with solid, comfortable pieces. "Never quite worked out that way, but there's plenty of space." He paused at the foot of a staircase made from native oak. "Your room's upstairs. Has a view of the creek if you like, watching water move." In the kitchen, Maria Santos looked up from kneading dough for tomorrow's bread. She was Miguel's wife, a warm woman in her 40s who'd been helping keep house since Colt's housekeeper passed 2 winters back. Her kind face creased with concern as she took in Eliza's fragile appearance. "Pobrecita," she murmured, wiping flour from her hands. "You sit, mija. I'll fix you something." Eliza hesitated until Colt gestured to a chair at the long pine table where he took most of his meals. She perched on the edge like she might need to run, but when Maria set down a plate of cornbread and honey with a glass of fresh milk, she ate with careful, deliberate bites. Her table manners were refined, another contradiction to the simple-minded label Dry Creek had pinned on her. Through the kitchen window, the sound of horses and men's voices carried from the corrals where the hands were settling the cattle for the night. Miguel Santos appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, his weathered face respectful but curious. He'd been Colt's foreman for 12 years, since the early days when the ranch was more hope than reality. "Boss, that new mare's favoring her left front. Want me to have a look tomorrow?" "Do that," Colt agreed. "Miguel, this is Miss Eliza Thorn. She'll be staying with us permanently. Family." Miguel's eyebrows rose slightly. Colt had never mentioned family besides his lost sister, but he touched his hat brim politely. "Welcome, señorita. You need anything, you ask." After Miguel left, Colt poured himself coffee from the pot that always simmered on Maria's stove. The kitchen felt peaceful in the gathering dusk, filled with the sense of yeast and wood smoke and the lingering sweetness of honey. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in a sky that stretched endless and clear. "That letter from your town," Colt said carefully. "Mentioned you don't speak much. That's fine by me. Sometimes quiet's the best conversation there is." Eliza's hands stilled on her glass. She looked at him with those dark, assessing eyes, and for just a moment he caught something that made his breath hitch. A fleeting expression, a tilt of her head that stirred memories buried deep. But then it passed, and she was just a tired woman again, worn down by whatever hardships had brought her to his door. Later, after showing her to the upstairs bedroom that faced east toward the creek, Colt retreated to his study. The room held his desk, ledgers, and the few personal treasures he'd accumulated over the years. Above the fireplace hung a painting of longhorn cattle at sunset, and on the mantel sat a daguerreotype of his parents and a small wooden box he rarely opened. Tonight, though, he lifted the box's lid and withdrew its contents carefully. A tarnished silver locket on a thin chain, the metal worn smooth by years of worried fingers. Inside was a faded photograph of a little girl with dark hair and serious eyes. His sister Annie, taken just months before she disappeared. The Apache raid had come in the spring of 1857, when Colt was 22 and thought himself man enough to protect his family. He'd been working their small farm outside Austin with his father, while Annie played near the creek that ran behind their cabin. The war party struck at midday when the men were in the fields. By the time Colt and his father reached the cabin, his mother lay dead and Annie was gone. They'd searched for weeks, following every trail, checking every Apache camp they could find or safely approach. Some raids were for horses or cattle, but children, especially girls, were sometimes taken to be raised as tribal members. The army had been sympathetic, but ultimately useless. After 6 months with no trace, his father had quietly given up hope, though he'd never said so aloud. Colt closed the locket and held it against his palm, feeling its familiar weight. 30 years he'd carried it, through his service in the war between the states, through the lean years building his ranch, through the gradual accumulation of wealth that should have meant contentment, but never quite filled the hollow space where his sister used to be. A soft sound from upstairs, floorboards creaking as someone moved carefully, reminded him that his house wasn't empty tonight. Eliza Thorn was settling into the room that faced the creek, the room he'd always thought might belong to Annie if she ever came home. The coincidence wasn't lost on him. A woman about the right age, with dark hair and those watchful eyes, arriving just when his memories felt particularly sharp. But coincidences were dangerous things to trust. He'd learned that lesson more than once, and hope could make a man see connections that weren't really there. Still, something about Eliza nagged at him. Not just her appearance, though, that had stirred something in his chest the moment she'd stepped down from Murphy's wagon. It was something else. The way she held herself, maybe, or the careful way she'd eaten Maria's cornbread, like someone who'd learned not to take kindness for granted. The letter from Dry Creek had been brief and dismissive. Eliza Thorn, it said, was simple-minded and had become a burden to the community. She had no living relatives except a distant cousin. Colt himself, though he couldn't recall any Thorns in his family line. The town council had voted to send her away rather than continue supporting her, and they'd identified him through old county records as her closest kin. But looking at her today, Colt found himself questioning every word of that letter. Simple-minded people didn't usually have such expressive eyes or eat with such careful manners, and the name Thorn meant nothing to him, though names could change easily enough on the frontier, especially for someone trying to escape a difficult past. Outside his study window, the night settled deep over the Broken Arrow. In the distance, cattle lowed softly and night birds called from the creek bottom. This was his world, built with his own hands and sweat, populated by people he trusted, governed by rhythms as old as the land itself. Tomorrow there would be work to do, cattle to move, fences to mend, accounts to balance. The business of living would continue as it always had. But tonight, for the first time in years, his house held more than just hired help and lingering memories. Upstairs, a woman who might be family slept in the room that faced the creek. Whether she was truly kin or simply another lost soul needing shelter, she was here now, and that changed something fundamental about the shape of his days. Colt tucked the locket back in its box and closed the lid gently. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever mysteries surrounded Eliza Thorn's arrival, he'd face them as he always had, with patience, careful observation, and the kind of steady determination that had built an empire from nothing but grass and hope. The old clock in the hallway chimed 11 as he climbed the stairs to his own room. Behind the door that faced the creek, all was quiet, but somehow the silence felt different now. Less empty, as if the very air in his house had changed composition, becoming something richer and more complex than the simple mixture he'd breathed alone for so many years. The first week passed quietly, with Eliza moving through the ranch like a shadow, trying not to disturb the light. She helped Maria in the kitchen, her hands sure and quick with familiar tasks, though she never spoke beyond the occasional nod or shake of her head. The ranch hands grew accustomed to seeing her hanging laundry or feeding chickens, always working but never getting in anyone's way. It was Thursday morning when everything changed. Colt was reviewing supply lists in his study when Miguel appeared in the doorway, his expression puzzled. "Boss, you need to see something. The gate latch on the north pasture. It's been giving us trouble all week, remember. Wouldn't stay closed proper." "What about it?" "Miss Eliza fixed it, and I mean really fixed it, not just jury-rigged. Come see." They rode out to the north pasture where the cattle grazed in the morning shade of a stand of cottonwoods. The gate that had been sticking and failing to latch properly now swung smooth and clicked shut with a satisfying sound of metal on metal. Miguel demonstrated the mechanism, shaking his head in amazement. "She used some kind of small spring system," he explained, pointing to the clever arrangement of wire and metal pieces. "Had to know exactly how the tension worked to make it operate this smooth. This isn't farm wife mending, boss. This is real mechanical understanding." Colt examined the latch carefully. The repair was elegant in its simplicity, using materials at hand but arranged with an engineer's eye for stress points and leverage. "When did she do this?" "Had to be early this morning. Tom found it working perfect when he came to move the cattle." Miguel's weathered face showed the kind of respect reserved for superior craftsmanship. "Takes a good mind to see a problem that clear and solve it that neat." That afternoon, a letter arrived from Dry Creek with the weekly mail delivery. Colt recognized the town clerk's careful handwriting on the envelope addressed to him, and his jaw tightened as he read the contents in the privacy of his study. The letter painted a disturbing picture of Eliza's life before her arrival at the Broken Arrow. According to the clerk's account, she'd been found wandering the outskirts of town 3 years ago, malnourished and wearing clothes that suggested she'd been traveling rough for weeks. No one knew where she'd come from, and her refusal to speak had led the townspeople to conclude she was touched in the head. The town had housed her in a small room behind the general store, using her as unpaid labor in exchange for meals and shelter. She'd swept floors, stocked shelves, and cleaned without complaint, but her silence and strange habits, like the way she sometimes stared at nothing for long minutes, or how she'd flinch when men spoke loudly, had made everyone uncomfortable. "She's harmless enough," the letter continued, "but queer in her ways. Sometimes you'd catch her moving her hands like she was talking to someone who wasn't there. The women thought it was some kind of fits, and Reverend Walsh said it might be the devil trying to speak through her. We decided it was better for everyone if she went to live with family." Colt set the letter down with more force than necessary, his anger building as he reread the casual cruelty between the lines. They'd treated her like a simple-minded burden, never once considering that her silence might stem from fear rather than inability. The image of Eliza, flinching from loud voices, painted a picture that made his chest tight with protective fury. A soft knock at his study door interrupted his dark thoughts. "Come in." Eliza entered hesitantly, carrying a small wooden object in her cupped palms. She approached his desk and gently set down what he realized was an intricately carved sparrow, no bigger than his thumb. The detail was extraordinary. Individual feathers etched with a fine tool, the bird's eye alert and lifelike, its posture suggesting it might take flight at any moment. "You made this?" he asked softly. She nodded, then reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a small folding knife, the blade worn thin from years of careful use. Her movements were deliberate as she showed him the tool, then pointed to the carving, then to herself. "It's beautiful," Colt said, picking up the wooden bird with the reverence it deserved. "The most beautiful thing I've seen in a long time." For the first time since her arrival, Eliza smiled. Just a quick upturn at the corners of her mouth, but it transformed her face entirely. She looked younger, less wary, and something in her eyes reminded him so strongly of his lost sister that his breath caught. "Eliza," he said carefully, "the people in Dry Creek, they didn't understand you, did they?" Her smile faded, and she shook her head firmly. Then, in a gesture that spoke volumes, she touched her temple and made a circular motion with her finger, the universal sign for crazy, followed by another firm shake of her head. "No," Colt agreed. "You're not crazy, not simple either. They just didn't take the time to see who you really are." She stared at him for a long moment, those dark eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether his words could be trusted. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she reached out and gently touched the wooden sparrow still resting in his palm. Then she did something that made his heart skip entirely. She pointed to the carving, then to the window that looked out over the creek, then to herself. The message was clear. Like the sparrow, she had been caged but dreamed of flying free. That evening at dinner, Colt watched Eliza with new eyes. She ate with Miguel and Maria and him around the kitchen table, as had become their custom, but tonight he noticed things he'd missed before. The way she anticipated Maria's needs, handing her salt before she asked for it. How she listened to Miguel's stories about the day's work with genuine interest, nodding at the right moments and asking questions with her expressive gestures that Miguel seemed to understand instinctively. "She's got good sense," Miguel said later when they were alone on the porch. "Sees things others miss. This morning she pointed out a loose board on the bridge before anyone else noticed it. Could have been dangerous if a horse stepped wrong." The townspeople thought she was simple-minded. Miguel spat into the dust beyond the porch steps. "People see what they expect to see, not what's really there. Makes them feel better about themselves when they can look down on someone else." After the household retired for the night, Colt sat in his study, turning the wooden sparrow over in his hands. The craftsmanship spoke of patience, skill, and an artistic vision that couldn't coexist with the mental deficiency Dry Creek had attributed to Eliza. Someone had taught her to carve, or she'd taught herself through careful observation and practice. Either way, it represented hours of quiet work and an intelligence far beyond what her former neighbors had credited her with. The letter from Dry Creek lay on his desk, like an accusation. Every dismissive word about Eliza's supposed condition now read like willful blindness. They'd seen what they wanted to see, a burden to be shuffled off to someone else rather than a human being deserving of patience and understanding. He thought about her gesture, comparing herself to the sparrow, caged but dreaming of flight. How long had she endured their assumptions and limitations? How many times had she wanted to explain or correct or simply be seen for who she truly was, only to be met with dismissive pats on the head and words spoken slowly as if she were a child? A sound from upstairs caught his attention, not quite footsteps, but the soft creak of floorboards under careful movement. He listened for a moment, then heard it again. Someone was awake and moving quietly, trying not to disturb others. Colt climbed the stairs silently, his boots soft on the wooden treads. A thin line of light showed beneath Eliza's door, and through it came a sound that made him pause in wonder. She was humming, a low, sweet melody that seemed to drift like smoke under the door. The tune was unfamiliar, but hauntingly beautiful, carrying notes of both sadness and hope. He stood there for several minutes, listening to this proof that her voice existed, that the silence the townspeople had taken for inability was instead a choice born of caution. When the humming stopped and the light disappeared, he retreated to his own room with his mind churning over everything he'd learned. The woman sleeping across the hall was no burden to be tolerated or charity case to be pitied. She was intelligent, skilled, artistic, and observant. Everything the people of Dry Creek had been too blind or selfish to see. They'd gotten rid of their problem by sending her to him, never realizing they'd given away something precious. As he lay in bed listening to the night sounds of his ranch, Colt made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow he would begin treating Eliza not as a poor relation to be housed out of duty, but as the capable, complex person she clearly was. Whatever had driven her to silence, whatever trauma had made her wary of the world, she was safe now. Here on the Broken Arrow, she could be herself without judgment or limitation. The wooden sparrow sat on his nightstand, its carved eye catching moonlight from the window. Like its creator, it was far more than it first appeared, not just a simple carving, but a work of art that revealed depths of skill and imagination. Tomorrow, he would start helping Eliza spread her wings. The morning sun was barely clearing the eastern hills when Colt found Eliza in the ranch office, surrounded by his accounting ledgers. The books lay open across the desk in an arrangement that would have looked like chaos to most people, but he could see the method in her organization. Income records here, expense tallies there, correspondence sorted by date and subject. "Good morning," he said gently, not wanting to startle her. She looked up with those dark, intelligent eyes and gestured to the ledgers, then to herself, then made a questioning motion with her hands. Her meaning was clear. "May I help with these?" Colt's bookkeeping had never been his strong suit. Numbers were tools to him, necessary for running a successful ranch, but not particularly interesting. His records were functional but messy, stuffed with loose papers and receipts that often took him longer to locate than the actual calculations required. "You think you can make sense of this disaster?" he asked with a wry smile. Eliza nodded confidently, then picked up his pen and wrote carefully on a scrap of paper. "I see the patterns." She worked methodically throughout the morning, reorganizing his financial records with the precision of a trained accountant. Miguel found them at noon when he came to report on the day's cattle count. "We've got 43 head in the south pasture, boss, and—" He stopped, staring at the transformed office. "What happened here?" "Miss Eliza's been organizing my books," Colt explained. "Look at this." The ledgers now told a clear story. Income from cattle sales, railroad investments, and land leases were recorded in neat columns. Expenses for feed, equipment, and wages were tracked by category and season. Most impressive of all, Eliza had identified several discrepancies where vendors had overcharged or made calculation errors. Miguel whistled low. She caught that mistake from Barrett's feed store last month. the one where they charged us twice for the same delivery. $7.30, Colt said, reading from Eliza's careful notation. I would never have noticed. A shadow fell across the office doorway, and Colt looked up to see Wade Morrison standing there uninvited. Morrison owned the Flying W, a smaller ranch that bordered the Broken Arrow to the north. He was a man in his mid-50s with the kind of confident bearing that came from inherited wealth rather than earned success. Heard you took in a charity case, Ransom, Morrison said, his eyes settling on Eliza with undisguised disdain. Town girl who's not quite right in the head. Miss Thorn is family, Colt replied evenly, though his voice carried a warning edge. And she's got more sense in her little finger than most people manage in their entire heads. Morrison laughed, a sound without warmth. Family. That's rich. You've been alone so long you're claiming kinship with every stray that wanders onto your land. His gaze swept the organized ledgers dismissively. Playing with papers doesn't make someone useful. This is cattle country, not a schoolhouse. Miguel stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his belt near his knife. Senor Morrison, you have business here, or you just come to insult our family? Actually, I do have business, Morrison said, though his tone remained unpleasant. Been thinking about expanding my operation. This valley would support twice the cattle it's running now if it was. Managed properly. Colt felt his jaw tighten. The Broken Arrow's doing just fine, thanks. For now. But things change, Ransom. Economic pressures, weather patterns, railroad access. A man's got to think ahead. Morrison's smile was thin and calculating. When you're ready to sell, I'll make a fair offer. More than fair, considering some of the challenges small operations face these days. Not interested? Morrison shrugged, but his eyes held something harder than casual disappointment. Well, you know where to find me when you change your mind. Things have a way of working out the way they're meant to. After Morrison left, the office felt smaller and somehow less safe. Eliza had gone very still during the confrontation, her hands pressed flat against the desk as if anchoring herself. When Colt looked at her, he saw fear in her eyes. Not the wariness she'd shown when dealing with new people, but something deeper and more immediate. He can't hurt you here, Colt said quietly. I won't let anyone hurt you. She wrote quickly on a piece of paper. I've seen men like him before. The simple sentence carried weight that made Colt's chest tight. How many Wade Morrisons had she encountered during her years of silence and vulnerability? How many times had she been forced to endure the contempt of men who saw her as something less than human? That afternoon brought a distraction in the form of fence repairs along the creek bottom. A late-season thunderstorm had brought down a large cottonwood, taking out nearly 50 yards of fence line. Colt and Miguel worked to clear the tree while the ranch hands strung new wire. Eliza appeared with a basket of food and cool water just as the sun reached its hottest point. But instead of simply delivering refreshments and leaving, she studied the damaged fence with the same focused attention she'd given the account ledgers. Something wrong with our work? Miguel asked good-naturedly. She shook her head, then pointed to where they'd positioned one of the fence posts. She gestured to show water flowing, then pointed upstream to where the creek curved. Her meaning became clear when she led them up the bank to examine the erosion patterns. She's right, Colt said, understanding immediately. The next big rain's going to wash that whole section out. We need to move the fence line back another 10 feet. It was hot, additional work they hadn't planned for, but Eliza's observation would save them from having to repeat the entire job after the next flood. As they repositioned the fence, Colt found himself watching her with growing respect and something else, a protective pride that surprised him with its intensity. By evening, word of Eliza's contributions had spread among the ranch hands. Tom Brennan, the youngest of the crew, approached Colt while they were settling the horses for the night. Boss, that lady, Miss Thorn, she really your cousin like you said? Why do you ask? It's just... Tom hesitated, then pushed ahead. She's got a way of seeing things others miss. Today with the fence, yesterday when she warned us about that loose board on the bridge. Makes a man wonder what else she might notice. It was a fair point. In less than 2 weeks, Eliza had proven herself more observant than most people he'd known for years. She saw patterns in numbers, problems in structures, dangers in natural systems. Her mind worked differently than others, not because of any deficiency, but because of a kind of clarity that came from careful observation and hard-won wisdom. That night, Colt sat on his porch, listening to the sounds of the ranch, settling into sleep. Cattle lowed softly in the distance, horses shifted in their stalls, and somewhere an owl called from the creek bottom. These were the sounds of his world, familiar and comforting. But they felt different now with Eliza here. She had brought something to the Broken Arrow that had been missing without him realizing it, a sense of completeness, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. Her organizational skills, her mechanical aptitude, her artist's eye for detail, all of it made his operation run smoother and feel more like a real home. Wade Morrison's visit had left a sour taste, though. The man's casual dismissal of Eliza, his veiled threats about economic pressures and challenges, none of it sat well. Morrison had always been ambitious, but there was something new in his manner today, something that suggested his interest in the Broken Arrow went beyond simple business opportunity. From upstairs came the soft sound of humming again, that beautiful melody Eliza shared only with the darkness. It made him think of his sister Annie, who used to sing while she played by the creek all those years ago. The memory brought its usual ache, but tonight it felt different, less like grief and more like hope waiting to be born. The thunderstorm that rolled through on Saturday night brought more than rain. It brought memories. Colt woke to the sound of someone moving in the attic above his room, soft footsteps crossing the plank floor where he stored the remnants of his family's life. Lightning illuminated his window in sharp, white flashes, followed by rumbles of thunder that seemed to shake the very bones of the house. He found Eliza at the top of the narrow attic stairs, standing before an open trunk with a sheet of old paper in her hands. The lantern she'd brought cast dancing shadows on the slanted walls, making the stored furniture and boxes look like sleeping giants. Rain drummed steadily on the roof just inches above their heads. "Couldn't sleep either?" Colt asked gently. She looked up at him, and in the lantern light he could see tear tracks on her cheeks. She held out the paper, a child's drawing done in pencil on brown wrapping paper. 2 stick figures stood beside a wavy line that might have been water, holding hands under a smiling sun. At the bottom, in a child's careful letters, someone had written Annie and Colt by the creek. The breath left his lungs in a slow exhale. He'd forgotten about that drawing, made by his sister when she was maybe 7 years old, and he was a young man who thought himself too important for such childish things. His mother had saved it, along with everything else that seemed too precious to discard. "I drew that," Eliza said softly, and the world tilted sideways. It was the first time he'd heard her voice since her arrival, and the words hung in the air between them like a bridge across 30 years of separation and sorrow. Her voice was low and sweet, roughened slightly from years of disuse, but unmistakably real. "Annie," he whispered. She nodded, fresh tears spilling over. "I remembered pieces, but seeing this, it all came flooding back. The way you used to carry me on your shoulders to check the fishing lines. How you taught me to skip stones. The morning you left for the fields and never came back." Colt reached for her then, pulling his sister into his arms for the first time since she was 6 years old. She felt small and fragile against his chest, but her embrace was fierce, desperate, as if she was afraid he might disappear again if she didn't hold tight enough. "I looked everywhere," he said against her hair. "For months, for years. I never stopped hoping, but I know." Her voice was muffled against his shoulder. "I know you did. I could feel it somehow, even when I couldn't remember who I was missing." They sat together on an old wooden crate while the storm raged overhead, and slowly, haltingly, Eliza, began to tell her story. The Apache who'd taken her had traded her to Mexican traders heading south. She'd been sold to a family in a small village who'd treated her more like property than a child. When she'd tried to tell them her real name, they'd beaten her for lying. "I stopped talking," she said simply. "It hurt less when I stopped trying to explain." Years had blurred together in that place. When she was old enough to work, they'd put her in the kitchen and the gardens. When she was old enough to attract unwanted attention from the men of the household, she'd run. North, always north, guided by some instinct that told her home lay in that direction. I must have walked for weeks before I collapsed outside Dry Creek. I was half dead from hunger and exposure, and I'd lost so much weight that I looked like a child again. When I wouldn't tell them who I was, they decided I was simple-minded. But you remembered how to read, how to work with numbers. She nodded. Some things stayed clear. Numbers, shapes, patterns. The important memories were buried deeper, hidden under so much fear and pain that I couldn't reach them. Until I came here. Until I saw you. Outside, the storm was beginning to move off, thunder growing more distant, but neither of them seemed inclined to move. They had 30 years to catch up. 30 years of separation to somehow bridge with words and shared memories. The name Thorn, where did that come from? The Mexican family's name was Espino. It means thorn in Spanish. When people in Dry Creek asked what I was called, I said Thorn because it was the only name I could remember. I'd forgotten our real name was Ransom. Colt pulled the old drawing closer to the lantern light, studying the careful way his sister had drawn their figures, holding hands. "You always were good with your hands. That wooden bird you carved. It reminded me of something, but I couldn't place it. You gave me a knife for my 6th birthday, a small one, just for whittling. You taught me how to use it safely, how to follow the grain of the wood." She smiled through her tears. "I've been carving birds ever since. They reminded me of something happy, even when I couldn't remember what." The implications of her presence here, of what it meant for both their futures, began to settle over Colt like a warm blanket. His sister was alive. Not only alive, but here, safe under his roof, where he could protect her from anyone who might try to hurt her again. "Wade Morrison," he said suddenly, remembering the other man's visit and Annie's fearful reaction. "You've met men like him before." Her expression darkened. The worst kinds of men seek out women they think are helpless. Women who can't or won't fight back, who have no one to protect them. She touched her throat unconsciously. "I learned to be very careful, very quiet. Sometimes invisible was the only safe thing to be." "That's over now," Colt said firmly. "You're not alone anymore, and you're not helpless. This is your ranch as much as mine. It should have been yours all along if things had been different." They made their way back downstairs as the storm moved on, leaving the air clean and cool in its wake. At the bottom of the attic stairs, Annie, he'd have to learn to think of her by her chosen name, Eliza, but in his heart, she'd always be his little sister, Annie, stopped and looked back up toward the stored treasures. "Thank you for keeping it all," she said quietly, "for keeping the memories safe until I could come home to claim them." In the kitchen, they made coffee and sat at the table where she'd eaten her first meal in his house just 2 weeks ago. Now everything was different. She was family in truth, not just in hope, and tomorrow he would have to figure out how to protect her from whatever Wade Morrison had in mind for the Broken Arrow Ranch. Because men like Morrison didn't give up easily, and now Colt had something infinitely more precious than land or cattle to protect. He had his sister back, and he'd be damned if he'd let anyone take her away again. Outside, the last of the thunder rolled away across the Texas hills, leaving only the gentle sound of rain on the roof and the quiet conversation of two people who'd found each other again after being lost for far too long. Dr. Benjamin Hayes arrived on a Tuesday morning, his black medical bag and air of professional competence making him seem almost out of place among the working men of the ranch. Colt had sent word to Austin requesting someone who specialized in what the medical journals were beginning to call disorders of the mind, though he privately suspected there was nothing disordered about his sister's mental faculties. "I understand you have concerns about a family member," Dr. Hayes said as they walked toward the house. He was a man in his 40s with kind eyes and the patient manner of someone who'd spent years dealing with human suffering. "My sister," Colt explained. "She's been through considerable trauma, and the people who cared for her before made some assumptions about her mental capacity that I believe were incorrect." They found Annie, in the kitchen garden, tending to Maria's tomato plants with the careful attention she brought to everything she touched. When Colt introduced Dr. Hayes, she looked up with that familiar wariness, but didn't immediately retreat as she might have a month ago. "Miss Ransom," Dr. Hayes said gently, using her real name for the first time in 30 years. "Your brother has asked me to speak with you if you're willing. There's no pressure. This is entirely your choice." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded and gestured toward the house. In the parlor, with afternoon light streaming through the tall windows, she sat carefully on the edge of a chair while Dr. Hayes settled across from her with his notebook. "I'd like to start with something simple," he said. "Can you tell me your name?" "Eliza Thorn," she replied, her voice still soft from years of disuse. "But my real name is Annie Ransom. I just remembered that recently." Over the next hour, Dr. Hayes conducted what he called a mental examination, asking questions that revealed the sharp intelligence Colt had already recognized. Annie solved arithmetic problems in her head, demonstrated her reading comprehension with a passage from one of his books, and showed her mechanical understanding by explaining how she'd repaired the gate latch. "There's absolutely nothing wrong with your mental faculties," Dr. Hayes concluded. "What you've experienced is what we call selective mutism, a response to severe trauma where speaking becomes associated with danger or pain. Your silence was protective, not pathological." He withdrew a small book from his bag, a manual on sign language used by deaf communities in larger cities. "This might help you communicate when speaking feels difficult. Many trauma survivors find it easier to express themselves through gesture than voice, especially when they're feeling overwhelmed." Annie accepted the book with obvious interest, immediately beginning to study the hand positions illustrated on the first page. Within minutes, she was forming simple signs, her natural dexterity making the movements look graceful even in their initial awkwardness. "Thank you," she signed, following the book's instructions, then repeated it aloud for emphasis. That evening, Dr. Hayes joined them for dinner and shared more of his observations. "Your sister has survived something that would have broken most people," he told Colt privately afterward. "The fact that she's maintained her intelligence, her capacity for kindness, her artistic abilities, it speaks to remarkable inner strength. Will she recover completely?" Recovery isn't about returning to who she was before the trauma. It's about becoming who she's meant to be despite it. She may always prefer quiet to crowds, solitude to social gatherings, but she's already far healthier than the people who labeled her simple ever realized. The next few days brought a transformation as Annie embraced her new method of communication. She practiced signs while doing her daily tasks, her hands spelling out words in the air as she thought through problems. Miguel proved surprisingly adept at learning alongside her, his natural expressiveness translating well to gestural language. It was during one of these practice sessions that the first sign of real trouble appeared. Annie was hanging laundry behind the house when she suddenly went rigid, the wet sheet in her hands forgotten. Colt looked up from the horse he was grooming to see her staring fixedly toward the northern boundary of the ranch. Her hands moved in rapid, urgent signs that he was still learning to read. "What is it?" he called, approaching her. "Men," she signed, then pointed toward a stand of trees near the property line. Watching. Colt squinted in the direction she indicated, but saw nothing unusual. Are you certain? She nodded emphatically, then gestured for him to come closer, leading him to a position where they were partially concealed by the clothesline. She pointed again. This time, Colt caught a glint of metal, sunlight reflecting off a spyglass or rifle scope. "Miguel," he called softly, not wanting to alarm the watchers with sudden movements. His foreman appeared from the barn, took one look at their tense postures, and understood immediately. "How many?" he asked quietly. Annie held up 2 fingers, then pointed to slightly different positions among the trees. She'd spotted both men while Colt had missed them entirely, her years of surviving by careful observation serving her well. "Been there long?" Miguel asked. Annie shrugged, signed something Colt didn't recognize, then wrote quickly in the dirt with a stick. "Maybe an hour. They think they're hidden." The implications were disturbing. The Broken Arrow was a large ranch, but not so large that casual travelers would need to observe it from concealment. These were men with a purpose, and that purpose likely involved Wade Morrison and his apparent interest in acquiring Colt's land. By evening, the watchers had withdrawn, but their presence left everyone on edge. Colt doubled the night watch and made sure all the ranch hands understood they were to report anything unusual immediately. Annie took to carrying a small mirror, a shard from a broken hand glass she'd found in the attic, using it to watch for reflected sunlight that might reveal hidden observers. "You think Morrison's behind this?" Miguel asked as they checked the evening security. "Can't prove it, but it's the only thing that makes sense." Colt's jaw tightened. Man's been sniffing around for weeks, talking about economic pressures and challenges. Now we have strangers watching the ranch like they're planning something. Annie appeared beside them, moving with the silent grace she'd developed during years of needing to be invisible. Her signs were becoming more fluid each day, and now she could communicate complex ideas almost as quickly as speaking. "They'll be back," she signed. "Men like that don't give up easily, and they know about me now. They were watching the house, not just the cattle." The thought of someone observing his sister, cataloging her routines and vulnerabilities, made Colt's blood run cold. Annie had survived too much to be threatened by some land-grabbing neighbor with more ambition than conscience. "We'll be ready for them," he said firmly. "Whatever Morrison's planning, he's going to find out that the Broken Arrow isn't as easy a target as he thinks." Annie nodded, but her expression remained troubled. She wrote quickly in her notebook and showed them, "There's something else." The way they positioned themselves, it wasn't random. They knew exactly where to watch from. Someone's been here before. Someone who knows the ranch well enough to pick the best vantage points. The implication hung heavy between them. Morrison might have an ally among the ranch hands, or at least someone who'd provided him with detailed information about the Broken Arrow's layout and routines. Trust, already strained by the presence of watchers, would now become a luxury they couldn't afford. As they returned to the house, Annie touched Colt's arm and signed a final, sobering thought. "I've lived with dangerous men before. These ones feel different, more organized, more patient. Whatever they want, they're planning to take it." That night, Colt sat up late cleaning his father's old rifle and thinking about the kind of men who watched from shadows. Whatever came next, he'd be ready to protect his sister and his home. He'd lost Annie once to violent men with selfish intentions. He wouldn't let it happen again. The memory came back to Annie in fragments, triggered by the simplest things. The scent of Maria's cornbread reminded her of their mother's kitchen. The sound of cattle lowing at dusk brought back evenings when she'd helped her father check the livestock. But it was the faded blue hair ribbon that shattered the last barriers around her buried past. Colt had been showing her through his collection of family keepsakes, hoping to stir more recollections. Most of the items sparked only vague feelings of familiarity. A wooden spoon their mother had used, their father's worn Bible, a small quilt that had covered her childhood bed. But when he lifted the blue ribbon from its careful nest in tissue paper, Annie's knees gave out. She collapsed into the chair beside his desk, her hands shaking as she reached for the strip of silk. "Where did you get this?" "It was in your hair the morning you disappeared," Colt said gently. "I found it caught on a tree branch near the creek. I've kept it all these years." The ribbon felt impossibly soft between her fingers, and suddenly she was 6 years old again, standing in front of her mother's mirror while gentle hands braided her hair and tied it with this same blue silk. She could smell her mother's lavender soap, hear her humming the lullaby she sang every night. "Mama always said blue brought out my eyes," Annie whispered, and then the tears came in earnest. For the next hour, memories poured out of her like water through a broken dam. The morning of the raid, when she'd been picking wildflowers by the creek while Colt and their father worked the far field. The thunder of approaching horses that she'd mistaken for a summer storm until she saw the painted faces of the Apache warriors. Her mother's scream from the cabin, cut short by sounds too terrible for a child to understand. "I hid in the root cellar," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But they found me. One of them grabbed me, and I fought so hard that this ribbon came loose and caught in his horse's mane. I kept reaching for it, trying to get it back, because it was the last piece of home I had." Colt listened without interrupting, his jaw tight with suppressed fury at what his baby sister had endured. When she finished, he took her hands in his, noting the faint scars on her palms from old rope burns and worse things she hadn't yet found the courage to name. "You're home now," he said simply. "You're safe, and you're home." That evening brought Wade Morrison's final ultimatum, delivered by one of his hands, a hard-faced man named Garrett, who sat his horse like someone accustomed to violence. The message was brief and to the point: sell the broken arrow within 30 days, or face the consequences. "What kind of consequences?" Miguel asked, his hand resting on his gun butt. Garrett's smile was thin and unpleasant. "The kind that happen to folks who don't listen to reason. Accidents, you might say. Bad luck that just seems to follow some people around." After Garrett rode away, the ranch hands gathered in the bunkhouse to discuss what everyone knew was coming. Annie listened from the kitchen window, her newly recovered memories making her understand the language of intimidation better than most. She'd seen what men like Morrison were capable of when they wanted something badly enough. The first accident happened 2 nights later. Annie woke to the sound of cattle bawling in distress and the acrid smell of smoke. She dressed quickly and ran outside to find organized chaos. The hay barn was burning, and the panicked livestock were breaking through fences in their effort to escape the flames and noise. The ranch hands worked frantically to contain the fire and gather the scattered cattle. Miguel organized bucket brigades while Tom and the others tried to calm the animals. But Annie noticed what the busy men missed. The fire had started in 3 different places simultaneously, and there were fresh horse tracks leading away from the barn that didn't match any of their horses. "This wasn't an accident," she signed to Colt when he paused for breath, his face streaked with soot. He followed her to where she pointed out the evidence, the multiple burn patterns, the unfamiliar tracks, the way the fire had been set to create maximum chaos without necessarily destroying the entire ranch. It was meant as a warning, not total destruction. "Morrison," Colt growled. Over the following weeks, the harassment escalated in carefully calculated steps. Fences were cut, allowing cattle to wander onto neighboring properties where Morrison's men would helpfully round them up for a fee. Water sources were mysteriously fouled with dead animals. Supply deliveries were delayed or misdirected, forcing expensive emergency purchases of feed and equipment. Each incident was deniable, explainable as coincidence or bad luck. But Annie's sharp eyes caught details that revealed the pattern of deliberate sabotage. She began keeping a detailed record of each incident, noting times, methods, and evidence left behind. Her experience with Morrison's surveillance teams had taught her to see what others missed. "He's wearing us down systematically," she explained to Dr. Hayes during one of his visits. The doctor had continued coming to the ranch weekly, partly to monitor her recovery, but mostly because he'd become genuinely fond of the family. It's what predators do: isolate their prey, exhaust their defenses, wait for the moment when resistance becomes too costly to maintain. Dr. Hayes studied her careful documentation with the respect due a fellow professional. "You've analyzed this like a military campaign. Survival teaches you to think strategically. Morrison's not just greedy, he's patient and thorough. That makes him dangerous in ways that simple violence wouldn't be." The breaking point came when Morrison's men attempted to rustle a significant portion of the herd during a moonless night. But Annie had anticipated the move, positioning herself as a lookout in the old oak tree that overlooked the main pasture. Her silent signal alerted Miguel and the others, allowing them to catch the rustlers in the act. The confrontation was brief but decisive. Faced with armed ranch hands who'd been expecting them, Morrison's men retreated without the stolen cattle. But they left behind something more valuable than livestock: proof of Morrison's involvement in the form of a distinctive rope and branding iron bearing the Flying W mark. "Now we have evidence," Colt said grimly as they examined the abandoned equipment by lantern light. But Annie knew it wouldn't be enough. Men like Morrison didn't get where they were by leaving themselves vulnerable to simple legal challenges. He would have covered his tracks, provided alibis, ensured that any evidence could be explained away or dismissed. "He'll escalate now," she warned. "We've frustrated his careful plan, embarrassed his men. The next move won't be subtle harassment. It'll be direct confrontation." That night, as she prepared for bed, Annie found herself thinking about the blue ribbon now carefully preserved in her own jewelry box. It represented everything she'd lost and found again: family, home, the sense of belonging somewhere safe and valued. Morrison threatened all of that, just as other violent men had threatened her throughout her life. But this time was different. This time she wasn't a helpless child or an isolated woman with no one to turn to. She had Colt, Miguel, the ranch hands who'd come to see her as family worth protecting. She had her voice back, her memories restored, and 30 years of hard-won wisdom about how dangerous men operated. Most importantly, she had something worth fighting for again. The Broken Arrow wasn't just Colt's ranch. It was their family home, the place where their parents had lived and loved and dreamed of a future for their children. Morrison could threaten and intimidate and scheme all he wanted. He would not take her home away again. The revelation came on a scorching August morning when Wade Morrison rode onto the Broken Arrow alone, carrying a leather satchel and wearing the confident smile of a man who held all the winning cards. Annie saw him coming from her position in the garden and felt her blood turn to ice water. There was something different about his posture today, not the careful menace of his previous visits, but the satisfaction of someone about to spring a long-planned trap. Colt emerged from the barn to meet Morrison in the front yard, his hand resting casually near his gun. Miguel and 2 other ranch hands positioned themselves within earshot, ready to back their boss if trouble started. But Morrison seemed supremely unconcerned about being outnumbered. "Morning, Ransom," he said pleasantly, dismounting with unhurried ease. "Beautiful day, isn't it? Perfect weather for settling old business." "Don't recall having any business with you, Morrison." "Oh, but we do." Morrison patted the satchel affectionately. "More business than you might imagine. You see, I've been doing some research into property records, family histories, that sort of thing. Fascinating what a man can discover when he knows where to look." Annie crept closer, using the vegetable garden rows as cover. Something about Morrison's tone made her skin crawl with recognition. It was the voice of a predator savoring the moment before the kill. "Get to the point," Colt said impatiently. Morrison's smile widened. "The point, my friend, is that charming lady you've taken in. Miss Eliza Thorn, or should I say, Annie Ransom." He looked directly at where Annie crouched among the tomato plants. Yes, I know exactly who you are, sweetheart. Have known since the day you arrived. The words hit Annie like a physical blow. Morrison's knowledge of her identity could only mean one thing. He'd been involved in her disappearance from the beginning. Impossible, Colt said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Is it? Let me tell you a story about a young entrepreneur back in 1857, barely out of his teens, but already ambitious. This young man had discovered there was good money to be made supplying Apache raiding parties with information about isolated homesteads, when families would be alone, what valuables they might possess, which properties had the best escape routes. Morrison opened his satchel and withdrew a bundle of yellowed papers. For a percentage of the take, this enterprising fellow would scout locations and provide detailed intelligence. Most raids were simple theft, livestock, goods, maybe a scalp or two for reputation. But sometimes the Apache would find something more valuable. A pretty little girl, for instance, who could be traded to Mexican slavers for considerable profit. The world seemed to tilt sideways as the implications became clear. Annie felt bile rise in her throat as memories clicked into horrifying focus. The Apache who'd taken her had known exactly where to find her, had ridden straight to the creek where she played while her family worked. They'd known her routines, her hiding places, even the fact that her father kept money hidden in the cabin. "You son of a bitch," Colt breathed, his hand moving toward his gun. "Careful now," Morrison warned, though he made no move toward his own weapon. "I've got men positioned all around this conversation. Besides, you'll want to hear the rest of my story before you do anything rash." He pulled out another document, this one bearing official-looking seals and signatures. "You see, that long-ago business arrangement created certain obligations. The Apache chief I dealt with, old Running Wolf, dead these 20 years. He kept careful records of his transactions, including a promissory note stating that any land ultimately inherited by survivors of our joint ventures would be subject to, shall we say, renegotiation." Annie stood slowly, no longer caring about concealment. "You sold me," she said, her voice carrying across the yard with deadly quiet. "You sold a 6-year-old child to slavers for money. Business is business, sweetheart, though I must admit, I never expected to see you again. Imagine my surprise when that fool Murphy mentioned delivering you here. At first, I thought it was just coincidence, another broken woman, seeking charity from her prosperous cousin. But then I started noticing little things." Morrison's eyes gleamed with malicious pleasure. "The way you moved, like someone accustomed to watching for danger. Those scars on your hands that spoke of hard use and harder treatment. Most tellingly, that distinctive birthmark near your left temple. Barely visible now, but I remember it from when you were small." He gestured toward the papers in his hand. "These documents prove my prior claim to any Ransom family assets, including this ranch. They're perfectly legal, properly witnessed, and backed by territorial law regarding Native American treaty obligations. In short, the Broken Arrow belongs to me, and it always has." "Those papers are forgeries," Colt snarled. "Are they? I spent considerable time and money ensuring they'd stand up to legal scrutiny. Amazing what authentic signatures and official seals can accomplish when one has the right connections." Morrison's smile turned predatory. "But here's the beautiful part. I'm willing to make you a deal." He looked directly at Annie, and she saw 30 years of patient planning in his eyes. "You come with me, willingly, and I'll allow your brother to keep his ranch. Refuse, and I'll take everything, the land, the cattle, the house your parents built. I'll leave him with nothing but memories and the knowledge that his sister's selfishness cost him everything he's worked for." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the grass. Annie felt the weight of every eye on her, saw the careful positioning of Morrison's hidden men in the peripheral shadows where they thought they couldn't be detected. "Why?" she asked finally. "After all these years, why now?" Morrison's expression shifted, revealing something darker and more personal than simple greed. Because you escaped, sweetheart. Because you slipped away from the life I'd arranged for you and denied me the profit of that investment. 30 years I've waited for the chance to collect what's owed me, and now that chance has finally come. The scope of his obsession became clear. This wasn't just about land or money. It was about possession, about reclaiming property he considered stolen from him. In Morrison's twisted logic, Annie belonged to him by right of purchase, and her years of freedom were a debt that needed to be settled. "The Apache who took me," she said, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "The ones who knew exactly where to find me, who came during the 1 hour when the men were away from the house. You told them when to come." "I told them when the picking would be easiest, yes. Your routine by the creek, your father's work schedule, the best approach routes, all valuable intelligence that ensured a successful operation with minimal risk to my associates." Colt's face had gone white with rage, but Annie could see him calculating odds, counting the shadows where Morrison's men waited. A direct confrontation now would end in bloodshed, and Morrison had chosen his timing well. Most of the ranch hands were scattered across the property, too far away to provide immediate support. "I need time to consider your offer," Annie said carefully. Morrison consulted a gold pocket watch with theatrical precision. "You have until sunset tomorrow. After that, my legal claim goes into effect regardless of your decision, and your brother loses everything anyway. Choose wisely, sweetheart. It's not often a woman gets to decide the fate of everyone she loves." He mounted his horse with the satisfied air of a man who'd played his cards perfectly. "Oh, and don't bother trying to run. I've got men watching every road out of the valley, and the law won't help you once they see these documents. Until tomorrow evening, then." As Morrison rode away, Annie felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. She'd escaped one form of slavery, only to find herself trapped by an even more elaborate cage, one that threatened not just her own freedom, but everything Colt had built and everyone who depended on the Broken Arrow for their livelihood. But 30 years of survival had taught her something Morrison hadn't counted on. Sometimes the most dangerous person in any situation was the one who'd already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. And Annie Ransom had been that person before, had clawed her way back from circumstances that should have destroyed her completely. Morrison thought he held all the cards, but he'd made one crucial miscalculation. He was still thinking of her as the helpless 6-year-old he'd sold into slavery all those years ago. He was about to learn exactly how wrong he was. That evening, the main house of the Broken Arrow became a war council. Miguel had quietly recalled every ranch hand from the far pastures, and now they gathered around the kitchen table like soldiers planning a campaign. Annie sat at the head of the table, no longer the silent woman who'd arrived in Murphy's wagon, but the clear-eyed strategist who understood their enemy better than anyone. "First thing we need to accept," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they faced, "is that Morrison's legal documents might actually hold up in court. He's had 30 years to perfect them, and territorial law regarding Indian treaties is murky enough that a corrupt judge could rule in his favor." Dr. Hayes, who'd arrived that afternoon at Colt's urgent summons, spread the documents Morrison had displayed across the table. His examination was thorough and disturbing. "These signatures appear authentic, and the territorial seals match examples I've seen in legitimate documents. If they are forgeries, they're extraordinarily sophisticated ones. Which means fighting this in court could take years and cost more than the ranch is worth," Miguel observed grimly. "By the time we proved they were fake, if we could, Morrison would already control everything." Colt cleaned his father's Colt .45 with methodical precision, the family pistol that had belonged to 3 generations of Ransom men. "Then we don't fight it in court," he said quietly. "We handle it the way our kind of people have always handled problems that can't be solved with lawyers." "No," Annie said firmly. "That's exactly what Morrison wants. For you to act rashly, to give him justification for killing you and claiming self-defense. He's probably got witnesses already positioned to swear he was protecting himself from violent criminals. She pulled out her notebook and began sketching a map of the ranch and surrounding area. Morrison thinks like a predator, but he's also a businessman. Everything he's done has been calculated for maximum profit with minimum risk. He won't expose himself to unnecessary danger unless he's confident of controlling the outcome. Tom Brennan leaned forward to study her drawing. What are you thinking, miss? I'm thinking that Morrison's greatest strength, his patience and careful planning, might also be his weakness. He's been working this scheme for decades, which means he can't adapt quickly when circumstances change. He's expecting us to react predictably, either surrender meekly or fight stupidly. She began marking positions on her map. Here's what I know about Morrison's operation from watching his men these past weeks. He's got maybe 8 or 10 hired guns, probably drifters and ex-soldiers he's picked up along the way. They're competent, but not particularly loyal. They're working for money, not conviction. Dr. Hayes looked up from Morrison's documents with sudden understanding. You're not planning to fight him, you're planning to expose him. Annie nodded. Morrison's entire scheme depends on maintaining the fiction that he's a legitimate businessman pursuing a legal claim. If we can prove he's a criminal who's been operating outside the law for 30 years, his forged documents become irrelevant. How do we prove something that happened 3 decades ago? Miguel asked. We make him confess, Annie said simply. Men like Morrison can't resist gloating when they think they've won. His ego demands that his victims understand exactly how clever he's been. She wrote quickly in her notebook, then tore out the page. Dr. Hayes, can you get this message to the Territorial Marshal in Austin? Tell him to bring a recorder and enough deputies to handle armed resistance. As Dr. Hayes read the note, his eyebrows rose. This is extremely dangerous, Annie. If Morrison suspects a trap, he won't, because I'm going to give him exactly what he wants. She looked around the table at the faces of men who'd become her family. Tomorrow evening, I'm going to surrender to Morrison voluntarily. The explosion of protest was immediate and vehement. Colt slammed his hand on the table hard enough to make the coffee cups jump. Absolutely not. I won't let you sacrifice yourself to save the ranch. You're not letting me do anything, Annie replied calmly. I'm a grown woman making a strategic decision. Morrison wants me to come willingly because it validates his belief that he owns me. His ego won't let him simply take me by force. He needs me to acknowledge his power. Miguel's weathered face creased with worry. Even if the marshal arrives in time, how do we know Morrison will confess to anything? He's been careful for 30 years. Why would he get careless now? Annie's smile held no warmth. Because he thinks I'm still that frightened 6-year-old he sold to the Apache. He doesn't realize that 30 years of survival have taught me a few things about manipulating dangerous men. She opened the family Bible that Dr. Hayes had been examining and withdrew a folded paper from between its pages. I found this yesterday while researching property records. It's a bill of sale from 1857, signed by Running Wolf and witnessed by several tribal elders. It documents the purchase of one female child, aged 6 years, healthy and unmarked, for $50 in goods and weapons. The paper passed from hand to hand in silence, each man absorbing the stark evidence of Morrison's crime. The transaction was recorded in matter-of-fact language that made Annie's stomach turn, but it was also legal proof of Morrison's involvement in child trafficking. Morrison doesn't know this document exists, she continued. Running Wolf kept it hidden with the tribal records, and it only came to light when the reservation was disbanded last year. If I can get Morrison to acknowledge this transaction while the marshal is listening, it becomes evidence of kidnapping, slavery, and conspiracy. Dr. Hayes finished. Crimes with no statute of limitations. The plan they developed over the next several hours was complex but necessarily so. Annie would meet Morrison as arranged, wearing a small recording device Dr. Hayes had acquired from a colleague who studied acoustics, The device was experimental and unreliable, but it might capture enough of Morrison's confession to support the documentary evidence. Meanwhile, the ranch hands would position themselves to cut off Morrison's escape routes while appearing to go about their normal evening routine. The territorial marshal and his deputies would arrive at sunset, using the creek bottom as cover to approach the meeting site without being detected by Morrison's watchers. "The timing has to be perfect," Annie warned. "If Morrison suspects anything before he's fully committed to the conversation, he'll either flee or start shooting. Either way, we lose our chance to end this permanently." As the meeting broke up, Colt caught his sister's arm gently. "Annie, I need you to understand. Losing the ranch would hurt, but losing you again would destroy me. If this goes wrong, it won't go wrong," she said with quiet confidence. "I've been preparing for this conversation my entire adult life. Every cruel master, every man who thought he could break me, every time I had to smile and pretend to be helpless while planning my escape, it was all training for tomorrow night." She touched the Colt .45 that lay on the table, then looked up at her brother with eyes that held the steel of hard-won wisdom. "Morrison thinks he's been hunting me for 30 years, but he's wrong. I've been hunting him, gathering strength, learning skills, becoming the kind of woman who can face down the monsters from her past." Later, as the household settled into an uneasy sleep, Annie sat on the front porch, listening to the night sounds of her home. Cattle lowing in the distance, horses shifting in their stalls, the soft conversation of men standing guard, all of it precious beyond measure because it represented safety and belonging she'd never thought to find again. In her lap lay the family Bible, its worn leather cover warm from her touch. Inside, tucked between pages that recorded births and deaths and marriages, was the bill of sale that would bring Morrison down. Tomorrow, she would use his own greed and arrogance against him, turning the very crimes he'd committed into the weapon of his destruction. The little girl he'd sold into slavery was gone forever, replaced by a woman who understood how to survive in a world where power and cunning mattered more than innocence or mercy. Morrison had created his own nemesis without realizing it, and tomorrow he would finally meet the full consequences of his choices. A soft sound from the kitchen drew her attention. Miguel checking the locks one final time before bed. Through the window, she could see Colt at the table, cleaning his pistol again with the methodical care of a man preparing for war. Her family, ready to fight for her and with her, trusting her judgment even when the stakes couldn't be higher. Morrison had spent 30 years believing he owned her. Tomorrow she would teach him the difference between owning someone and underestimating them. It was a lesson he would not live to forget. The sun hung low over the town of Cedar Falls as Annie walked slowly toward the church at the center of the dusty main street. Word had spread throughout the afternoon. Wade Morrison had called for a public gathering to resolve a legal matter of significant importance to the community. The town bell had rung at 5 o'clock, its bronze voice carrying across the valley like a summons to judgment. Annie's heart beat steady and strong as she approached the crowd gathered in the church square. Men and women from neighboring ranches, shopkeepers from town, even some of the Mexican families from the settlements south of the river, all had come to witness what Morrison had promised would be a revelation that would set the record straight about certain criminal activities in our midst. Morrison stood on the church steps like a preacher preparing to deliver a sermon, his black suit immaculate and his silver hair gleaming in the golden light. Beside him stood Sheriff Coleman, looking uncomfortable but resigned, and two men Annie didn't recognize, well-dressed strangers who had the bearing of lawyers or government officials. "Friends and neighbors," Morrison began, his voice carrying easily across the square, "I've called you here today to witness the resolution of a matter that has plagued this community for far too long. Some of you may have heard rumors about the woman currently residing at the Broken Arrow Ranch. A woman who has been deceiving us all about her true nature and criminal past." A murmur ran through the crowd as Annie stepped into the circle of gathered townspeople. She wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that Maria had helped her alter, and carried herself with quiet dignity despite the hostile stares of those who still believed Morrison's lies. "Miss Eliza Thorn," Morrison continued, his eyes finding hers across the crowd. "Or should I say, Miss Annie Ransom, wanted fugitive from justice and accomplice in crimes too numerous to list. For 30 years, she has evaded the consequences of her actions, living under false names and identities while honest people suffered for her crimes." Dr. Hayes emerged from the crowd, his medical bag in one hand and a leather portfolio in the other. "That's quite an accusation, Mr. Morrison. Do you have evidence to support such serious charges?" "Indeed I do, Doctor." Morrison gestured to one of the well-dressed strangers, who stepped forward with an official-looking document. "This is a warrant for the arrest of Annie Ransom, issued by territorial authorities in 1857 for her role in providing intelligence to Apache raiders. She helped plan the attacks that devastated homesteads throughout this region, including the raid that killed her own parents." The crowd's murmur grew louder, angry voices mixing with shocked gasps. Annie felt the weight of their judgment pressing against her like a physical force, but she kept her expression calm and her hands steady. This was exactly what she'd expected. Morrison was painting her as the villain in his carefully crafted story. "That's a lie!" Colt's voice cut through the noise as he pushed through the crowd to stand beside his sister. "Annie was 6 years old when our parents were killed. She was a victim, not a criminal." Morrison's smile was triumphant. "Was she? Then perhaps you can explain how Apache raiders knew exactly when your family would be most vulnerable, exactly where to find the child they came to take, exactly how to avoid the security measures your father had put in place." He pulled another document from his coat, this one bearing what appeared to be an official territorial seal. "This is a sworn statement from 3 Crows, one of the Apache survivors of that raid, given before his death last year. He confirms that the raiders received detailed intelligence about the Ransom homestead from a source within the family, information that could only have come from the child herself." The accusation hit the crowd like a thunderbolt. Even those who'd been sympathetic to Annie began to look at her with suspicion and growing anger. The logic of Morrison's story was compelling in its simplicity. How else could raiders have known so much about the family's routines unless someone had told them? "You're saying a 6-year-old child betrayed her own family?" Dr. Hayes's voice carried clear skepticism. "I'm saying that some people are born with corruption in their souls, Doctor. Age doesn't matter when evil finds a willing vessel." Morrison's gaze fixed on Annie with theatrical sadness. "The Apache who took her didn't just find a random child. They found an eager collaborator who helped them plan the very attack that destroyed her family." Sheriff Coleman stepped forward reluctantly, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Miss Ransom, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me. These are serious charges that need to be investigated properly." Annie looked around the circle of faces surrounding her, some angry, some confused, all watching to see how she would respond to Morrison's accusations. She could see Colt's barely contained rage, Dr. Hayes's worried concern, and beyond the crowd, the subtle positioning of ranch hands, ready to fight if necessary. But she also saw something Morrison had missed in his careful planning. In the shadows near the church, partially concealed by the evening darkness, stood several men in the blue uniforms of territorial marshals. They'd arrived exactly as planned, and now they waited to hear what Morrison would say when he thought he'd finally won. Annie stepped forward into the center of the circle, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "Mr. Morrison, before Sheriff Coleman arrests me, would you mind answering one question about these charges?" Morrison's eyes glittered with satisfaction. "Of course, my dear. I believe in transparency in all legal matters. How exactly did you come by this information about Apache intelligence sources? It seems remarkably detailed for events that happened 30 years ago." The question hung in the air like the ringing of the church bell, and Annie saw the first flicker of uncertainty cross Morrison's face. He'd been so focused on his moment of triumph that he hadn't considered where his story might lead him. That is, territorial records contain extensive documentation of Indian raids and their methods. But this document mentions specific details about my family's routines, our property layout, even my father's hiding places for money and valuables. How would territorial records contain such intimate knowledge unless someone had provided it to them, someone who had observed our family very closely indeed? The crowd began to murmur again, but now the sound carried a different quality. Morrison's story was beginning to develop holes that even his careful preparation couldn't fill. Morrison's face flushed red as he realized the trap Annie had laid for him, but his arrogance wouldn't let him retreat, and 30 years of believing his own lies made him double down on his story. The territorial authorities conducted thorough investigations of all Indian raids, he said, his voice slightly less steady than before. They interviewed survivors, examined evidence. What survivors? Annie interrupted, her voice carrying across the silent square. You just told this crowd that the Apache killed both my parents and took me. Who exactly survived to provide all these intimate details about our family's daily routines? Dr. Hayes stepped forward, his leather portfolio open to reveal official-looking documents. Actually, Mr. Morrison, I took the liberty of reviewing the territorial records you mentioned. There are no investigation reports about the ransom raid, no survivor interviews, and no documentation of the kind of detailed intelligence you've described. Morrison's eyes darted to the crowd, then to Sheriff Coleman, searching for support that was rapidly evaporating. Those records were classified for security reasons. Were they? Annie pulled the family Bible from beneath her shawl and opened it to reveal the yellowed document hidden inside. Then perhaps you can explain this bill of sale, written in Running Wolf's hand and witnessed by 3 tribal elders. It documents the purchase of one female child, aged 6 years, for $50 in goods and weapons. The buyer is listed as W. Morrison, white trader. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the evening breeze seemed to hold its breath as the implications of the document sank into the minds of the gathered crowd. Morrison stared at the paper in Annie's hands as if it were a snake about to strike. That's impossible, he stammered. I've never seen that document before. Anyone could have forged. The paper is genuine reservation parchment, Dr. Hayes announced, his voice carrying the authority of expert knowledge. The ink matches samples from other tribal documents of the same period. Most importantly, the signatures have been verified by territorial officials who knew Running Wolf personally. Sheriff Coleman's hand moved to his gun, but this time it wasn't pointed toward Annie. Morrison, you want to explain how your name ended up on a bill of sale for a kidnapped child? Morrison's composure finally cracked. It's not what you think. The Apache were going to take her anyway. I just made sure they got paid properly for their trouble. It was business, nothing personal. The admission hit the crowd like a physical blow. Women gasped in horror. Men stepped back as if Morrison carried some contagious disease, and angry voices began rising from all sides of the square. You sold a child into slavery, someone shouted from the crowd. Murdered her parents for money. How many other families did you betray? Morrison looked around desperately, finally realizing that his carefully crafted deception was collapsing around him. You don't understand. The frontier was chaos back then. People did what they had to do to survive. I provided a service, helped both sides reach mutually beneficial arrangements. You provided intelligence that got innocent people killed, Annie said, her voice cutting through the noise with deadly quiet. You told the Apache when my father would be in the fields, when my mother would be alone in the house, where they kept their valuables hidden. You planned the whole raid and took a percentage of the profits. Prove it, Morrison snarled, his mask of respectability finally slipping completely. You were 6 years old. What could you possibly remember about? I remember you, Annie said simply. I remember the white man who came to our house the week before the raid, asking my father about his work schedule, complimenting my mother on her jewelry, paying special attention to our family's routines. You told my father you were interested in buying land in the area. Morrison's face had gone pale, but his trapped animal desperation made him dangerous. Even if any of that were true, it was 30 years ago. The statute of limitations— "There is no statute of limitations on murder and kidnapping," announced a new voice from the edge of the crowd. Marshal Frank Dawson stepped into the circle of light, his badge gleaming on his vest and his hand resting on his gun. "Wade Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, child trafficking, and operating a criminal enterprise." Behind the marshal came 4 deputies, their weapons drawn and their positions carefully chosen to cut off any escape routes. Morrison's own hired guns, scattered throughout the crowd, found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered by men who'd been planning this moment all day. "This is outrageous," Morrison protested, but his voice carried the hollow ring of defeat. "I demand legal representation. I have rights." "You have the right to remain silent," Marshal Dawson said grimly, producing a pair of iron shackles. "Considering what you've confessed to in front of 50 witnesses, I'd recommend using it." As the marshal's men closed in around Morrison, Annie felt a strange sense of completion settling over her. The man who'd destroyed her childhood, who'd sold her into 30 years of suffering and fear, was finally facing the consequences of his choices. The little girl who'd hidden in the root cellar while her world burned was gone forever, but the woman she'd become had found the strength to seek justice rather than mere revenge. Colt appeared at her side, his arms sliding protectively around her shoulders. "It's over," he said quietly. Annie nodded, watching as Morrison was led away in chains while the crowd began to disperse, their excited conversations filling the evening air with the sound of justice finally served. "Yes," she agreed, feeling 30 years of fear and pain beginning to lift from her shoulders like morning mist. "It's finally over." 6 months after Wade Morrison's trial and conviction, the Broken Arrow Ranch had settled into rhythms that felt both familiar and wonderfully new. Spring had come early to the Texas Hill Country, bringing with it green grass, wildflowers, and the kind of hope that grows slowly but runs deep. Annie stood on the front porch of the main house, watching the sun rise over land that truly belonged to her family once again. The legal proceedings had been swift and decisive. Morrison's public confession, combined with the documentary evidence and testimony from his former associates, had resulted in a life sentence for murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. His ranch and assets had been forfeited to compensate his victims, with a significant portion awarded to the Broken Arrow as restitution for 30 years of stolen inheritance. But the real victory wasn't measured in money or land. It was measured in the quiet confidence with which Annie moved through her days, no longer looking over her shoulder for dangers that might emerge from shadows. Her voice, once lost to fear, now filled the house with conversation and laughter. Her hands, scarred by years of hard use, now created beauty in her workshop, where she carved intricate wooden sculptures that had begun attracting buyers from as far away as San Antonio. "Morning, sister," Colt said, stepping onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee steaming in the cool air. "Morning, brother." The words still felt like small miracles, family titles reclaimed after decades of believing they'd been lost forever. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching Miguel and the ranch hands prepare for another day of spring work. The cattle were thriving, the horses were healthy, and the books, now impeccably maintained by Annie's skilled hands, showed the kind of prosperity that came from hard work and careful management. "Dr. Hayes will be here this afternoon," Colt mentioned casually, though Annie caught the slight smile that tugged at his lips. "I know." She felt her own smile growing in response. "He asked me to marry him last week." Colt's coffee cup paused halfway to his mouth. "And?" "I said yes." The words came out quietly but with absolute certainty. "He's a good man, patient and kind. He sees who I really am, not who I was forced to be." Benjamin Hayes had continued his weekly visits to the ranch long after Annie's recovery was complete, drawn first by professional interest, then by friendship, and finally by something deeper. He'd courted her with the gentle persistence of a man who understood that trust was built in small increments, not grand gestures. His proposal had come while they were walking by the creek, simple and honest. "Annie, would you consider spending the rest of your life letting me love you the way you deserve?" "When?" Colt asked, his voice carefully neutral despite the obvious pleasure in his eyes. "This fall, when the work slows down. Sarah Williams has agreed to help with the planning." Annie glanced at her brother with subtle mischief. She seems quite eager to be involved in wedding preparations, almost as if she's hoping for some practice. Now it was Colt's turn to look slightly embarrassed. Sarah Williams, the school teacher from Cedar Falls, had become a frequent visitor to the Broken Arrow in recent months. Her official reason was helping Annie improve her reading and writing skills, but everyone on the ranch had noticed that she seemed particularly interested in discussing literature with their boss. "Sarah's a fine woman," Colt admitted. "She is. And she looks at you the same way Benjamin looks at me. Like you're the answer to questions she didn't even know she was asking." A comfortable quiet settled between them as they watched the morning activities of their ranch. In the corral, Tom Brennan was working with a young horse, his patience and skill turning what could have been a battle of wills into a dance of mutual respect. Near the barn, Maria Santos hung laundry that snapped cheerfully in the spring breeze. From the kitchen came the sounds and smells of breakfast being prepared for the hands who worked so hard to keep their world running smoothly. "I've been thinking," Annie said eventually, "about starting a school." Colt raised an eyebrow. "What kind of school?" "For children like I was. The ones people assume are slow or damaged or hopeless. There are more of them than we realize. Children who've been hurt or traumatized, but still have so much potential if someone just takes the time to see it." The idea had been growing in her mind for months, nurtured by her own experience of being dismissed and underestimated. She'd learned sign language not just for herself, but to help others who struggled with traditional forms of communication. Her workshops with Dr. Hayes had shown her how healing could happen when someone felt truly seen and valued. "Where would you build it?" "I was thinking about Morrison's old place. It's good land going to waste, and the house could be converted easily enough. We could take in maybe a dozen children to start, give them a place to heal and learn and discover what they're truly capable of." Colt nodded slowly, his practical mind already working through the logistics. "It's a good idea. Important work. But are you sure you're ready for that kind of responsibility?" Annie smiled, thinking of the wooden bird she'd carved that first week on the ranch, the sparrow that had represented her own caged dreams of freedom. "I've spent 30 years learning how to survive in a world that wanted to break me. Now I want to teach other people how to do more than just survive. I want to show them how to fly." Later that afternoon, as Dr. Hayes arrived for his visit and Sarah Williams appeared, with her satchel of books, the front porch of the Broken Arrow filled with the quiet conversations of people building a future together. Annie sat in the comfortable chair Colt had made for her, working on a new carving while Benjamin read aloud from a medical journal, and Sarah helped plan lessons for the school that existed only in dreams, but felt completely possible. On the mantel inside, a new addition had appeared beside the family photographs and mementos. It was a formal portrait taken in Cedar Falls just last week. Annie and Colt standing together, both of them smiling with the kind of happiness that comes from knowing exactly where you belong. The little girl who'd been sold into slavery was gone forever, along with the broken woman who'd arrived in Murphy's wagon 6 months ago. In their place stood Annie Ransom, soon to be Annie Hayes, sister, fiancée, teacher, and survivor. She'd reclaimed not just her name and her family, but her right to dream of a future filled with love, purpose, and the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered. As the sun set over the Broken Arrow Ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Annie felt the deep contentment that came from being exactly where she was meant to be. Home, at last, and free to become whoever she chose to be.